Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, welcome to Dreamless Timelines. Go ahead and hit that like button, maybe subscribe if you feel like it, but honestly, no pressure. The vibe here is pretty low stakes. Tonight, we are going to be diving into a topic that usually gets people pretty excited, but we're going to handle it in the driest, most historical way possible. We are talking about the history of cannabis. Or weed, or pot, or whatever your parents called it when they found it under your bed in high school. But we aren't just stopping there. We're going to float around through history to look at all sorts of weird medicinal habits, ancient chill-out sessions, and the very specific type of drama that happens when humanity discovers a plant that makes doing nothing feel like an accomplishment. So, grab a blanket, turn the brightness down on your phone, and let's just sort of drift into the past. It's going to be a long ride, so get comfy. We really have to start way back, like way back before anyone was worrying about whether it was legal or not, back when the biggest worry was getting trampled by a horse or dying of a tooth infection at age 25. We're going to Central Asia, specifically the steppes. If you don't know the steppes, just imagine a wildly large, flat, grassy ocean of land where the wind never stops blowing and everyone is incredibly tough. Enter the Scythians. Now, usually when historians talk about the Scythians, it's all about their gold, their archery, and the fact that they were terrifying nomads who could shoot an arrow backward while riding a horse at full speed, which is admittedly a pretty big flex. But we aren't here for the warfare. We're here for their downtime. Our main source for this is Herodotus. Now, we have to take Herodotus with a grain of salt. Actually, maybe the whole salt shaker. He was basically the ancient Greek version of a tabloid gossip columnist who traveled around hearing stories and then wrote them down with a solid, do trust me energy. But archaeology has actually backed him up on this one. Herodotus tells us that after a burial, because nothing says party like a funeral in the ancient world, the Scythians would set up a distinct kind of tent. They would take 3 sticks, lean them together, and cover them with woolen felt. Basically, they built a prehistoric blanket for it. Inside this tent, they placed a dish filled with red-hot stones. Then the Scythians would crawl inside, take some hemp seeds, and throw them on the hot rocks. Herodotus writes, quite literally, that the Scythians would howl with pleasure from the smoke. Now, he claims it was a vapor bath, and sure, maybe they were just really into saunas, but let's be real, they were hotboxing a tent on the windy plains of Eurasia. It's kind of a hilarious image if you think about it. These terrifying, tattooed warriors who struck fear into the hearts of civilized empires just huddled together under a blanket, giggling and eating snacks because they inhaled too much smoke. It wasn't just recreational, though. It was deeply ritualistic. But isn't that always the excuse? No, Mom, it's for a ritual. But for the Scythians, it really was connected to the afterlife. They buried their dead with pouches of cannabis seeds. Archaeology has found these frozen tombs in the Altai Mountains, specifically the Pazuric burials, where the permafrost preserved everything. They found distinct braziers, burnt hemp seeds, and even rugs. So these guys wanted to make sure that even in the afterlife they had a stash ready to go. It's weirdly relatable. You pack the essentials, your horse, your gold, your weapons, and your relaxation herbs. Let's float over to another part of the ancient world, drifting east toward China. The history of cannabis in China is super long and actually starts out pretty boring, which is perfect for us. For a long time, cannabis, or ma as they called it, wasn't about getting high at all. It was about pants. Literally, it was a fiber crop. They used hemp to make clothes, ropes, bowstrings, and fishing nets. It was the workhorse of the agricultural world. You couldn't smoke a fishing net, obviously, so for centuries, the plant was just looked at as a useful fibrous weed. But then we get to the legend of Emperor Shennong. Now, Shennong is one of those figures who probably didn't exist as one single guy, but history likes a face to put on things. He's called the Divine Farmer. Legend says he ruled around 2800 BC, which is suspiciously long time ago. He's credited with teaching China how to do agriculture. The weirdest detail about Shennong, and I love this, is that he supposedly had a transparent stomach, like you could see right into his gut. The idea was that he'd wander around the forests and fields, eating random plants to see what they did. If he ate something poisonous, he'd look down at his see-through stomach, watch the plant turning his insides green or black, and then quickly eat a different plant to counteract it. It's essentially the most high-stakes version of a mukbang imaginable. Anyway, Shennong is credited with writing the Penzao Qing, or the Great Herbal. In this text, cannabis is mentioned as a medicine, but the ancient Chinese doctors were a bit wary of it. They knew it had properties. The text says that if you take too much, you'll start seeing devils and running around like a maniac, which, to be fair, sounds like a bad trip. But the text also says that if you take it over a long period, it allows one to communicate with spirits and lightens the body. So you have this duality. On one hand, it's a useful medicine for things like rheumatism, gout, and even malaria. On the other hand, if you take too much, you're going to think a dragon is eating your house. The Taoist monks eventually got into it too. They were all about finding the elixir of life and achieving immortality. They figured that if this plant made you feel like you were floating, maybe it was actually helping you float toward divinity. They'd burn incense made of it during ceremonies. It's funny to imagine these very serious robed monks in misty mountains trying to achieve perfect stillness and meditation while arguably just being incredibly stoned. There's a story about a Taoist alchemist who mixed cannabis with ginseng and claimed it allowed him to see the future. I'm pretty sure he just saw a really vivid version of the present, but who am I to judge? The Chinese eventually sort of moved away from the psychoactive use of it as Confucianism took over. Confucianism is all about order, family, and social hierarchy. Being stoned out of your mind and giggling at a wall doesn't really fit the dutiful son vibe. So cannabis became strictly a fiber crop and a dull medicine again, while wine became the intoxicant of choice for the poets. Which is a shame, really. I feel like we missed out on some very interesting Confucian philosophy that could have been written if they'd stuck with the seeing devils plant. Now let's drift south, over the Himalayas into India. If the Scythians were using it to party after funerals, and the Chinese were using it to check their transparent stomachs, India is where cannabis really found a spiritual home that stuck. We're talking about the Vedas, the sacred texts composed thousands of years ago. Specifically, the Atharva Veda mentions cannabis, or Bhang, as one of the 5 sacred plants. It was called a source of happiness and a liberator. This is where we have to talk about Shiva. If you don't know Hindi mythology, Shiva is one of the big 3 gods. He's the destroyer, but he's also the patron god of yoga and meditation. He's a complex dude. He spends a lot of time sitting on a mountain, Mount Kailash, meditating to keep the universe from falling apart. The legend goes that Shiva had a bit of a temper. Understandable when your job description is the destroyer. And after a particularly nasty family dispute, or perhaps just a long day of cosmic management, he wandered off into the fields. He fell asleep under a leafy plant. When he woke up, he was curious, so he sampled the leaves. Instantly, he felt rejuvenated, chill, and ready to handle the universe again. From that day on, cannabis was Shiva's favorite snack. Because of this divine endorsement, consuming cannabis in India wasn't seen as some sketchy habit you did behind the gym. It was, and still is, a religious act for many. We aren't talking about smoking joints, though. That came much later. In ancient India, it was mostly about Bhang. Bhang is essentially an ancient edible, or rather a drinkable. It's a preparation of cannabis leaves, milk, sugar, spices like cardamom and ginger, and maybe some almonds. It's like a weed milkshake. It sounds kind of delicious, actually, much better than the acrid smoke the Scythians were inhaling in their tents. For thousands of years, holy men in India, sadhus, have used Bhang to help them meditate. These guys are the real deal. They give up all their worldly possessions, cover themselves in ash, and wander the country living on charity and prayers. And of course, consuming enough Bhang to knock out a small elephant. The idea is that it helps them detach from the physical world and focus on the spiritual one. It cuts the tether to earthly worries. It's kind of wild to think about the cultural differences here. In the West, for a long time, being intoxicated was seen as a loss of control, a sin. In this context, it was a tool for focus, a way to shut up the noisy brain so you could hear the gods. Of course, it wasn't just for the holy men, it was used for everything. Got a fever? Have some Bhang. Can't sleep? Bhang. Digestion issues? Bhang.
Warriors would even take a swig of it before battle, to calm their nerves. Imagine that energy, standing on a battlefield, sword in hand, staring down an enemy army, and just being absolutely toasted on a spiced almond milk drink. Whatever happens, happens, man. There's a funny historical contrast here. When the British eventually showed up in India, way later, and we'll get to the colonial nonsense eventually, they were completely baffled by this. They were used to alcohol. They understood whiskey. Whiskey makes you loud, aggressive, and stumble around. They saw these Indians sitting quietly, smiling beatifically, and drinking green milk, and the British were like, what is wrong with these people? Why aren't they fighting? They commissioned a massive study, the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission in the 1890s, to figure out if this stuff was driving people crazy. After thousands of pages of research, the British basically concluded, actually, it seems pretty harmless, and if we ban it, everyone will just get really annoyed. So carry on.
But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let's pull back to the ancient world and float over to the Middle East. The Islamic world has a very interesting relationship with intoxicants. As most people know, the Quran strictly forbids alcohol. Khamr, the Arabic word for intoxicants, is generally interpreted as fermented drinks like wine. But cannabis, that was a bit of a gray area for a long time. It wasn't mentioned by name in the Holy Book, so for centuries, scholars and regular people played a game of technicality. It became known as the wine of the poor, or sometimes the herb of the fakirs. While the rich elites might sneak glasses of wine in their palaces, the common people and the mystical Sufis turned to hashish. Hashish is the concentrated resin of the cannabis plant. It's stronger, stickier, and hits harder than just the leaves. The story of its discovery in the Islamic world is suspiciously similar to the Shiva story, just with a different cast of characters. There's a legend about a Sufi monk named Haidar, who was a very strict ascetic. He never smiled, never joked, just prayed and fasted. Total buzzkill. One day, he went for a walk in the mountains and came back with a weird, happy grin on his face. His disciples were like, "Master, are you okay? You look pleasant. It's unnerving." Haidar showed them the plant he'd eaten. He told them it had banished his sadness and allowed him to feel the joy of God. He asked them to keep it a secret. But of course they didn't. Telling a bunch of disciples to keep a secret is like telling the internet not to make a meme out of something. It spread like wildfire. By the medieval period, hashish was everywhere in the Arab world. It became a huge part of social life in places like Cairo and Baghdad. There were hashish gardens, basically ancient coffee shops where people would go to hang out, listen to music, and zone out. But of course, where there is fun, there is a buzzkill government trying to stop it. We see this cycle repeat over and over. In 1378, an emir in Egypt named Sudan Shaikuni decided he'd had enough of everyone giggling. He was the first major ruler to try a full-on war on drugs. He ordered all the cannabis plants in the Jonema Gardens to be ripped up. But he didn't stop there. He ordered that anyone caught eating hashish should have their teeth pulled out. Yeah, he went straight to dental torture. Oh, you like to chew on this resin? Well, good luck chewing without molars. It was brutal. But like most prohibitions, it didn't work. People just went underground, they hid their stashes, they bribed the guards, and the moment the emir died, everyone went right back to the gardens. It's a classic human story. Authoritarian leader versus a plant, and the plant usually wins in the long run because people really like being altered. Let's shift gears a little bit. We've talked about the fun side of weed, but we need to talk about the fiber again. Because while the Sufis were getting high in Cairo and the sadhus were drinking milkshakes in Varanasi, Europe was doing something completely different. Europe was obsessed with hemp, but strictly for the grind. In medieval Europe, hemp was critical. You couldn't run a navy without it. The sails were canvas, a word that actually comes from the word cannabis. The ropes were hemp, the clothes of the peasants were hemp, It was a strategic resource. If you ran out of hemp, your ships couldn't sail, and if your ships couldn't sail, you couldn't invade your neighbors, and that was just unacceptable for a medieval king. King Henry VIII, yeah, the guy with all the wives, actually passed a law in 1533. It essentially said, if you are a farmer, you must grow hemp. He fined farmers who didn't dedicate a portion of their land to it. He didn't care if they smoked it. They mostly didn't know you could. He just needed ropes for his big, fancy warships. There's something ironic about Henry VIII, a man who clearly had zero chill and probably high blood pressure, mandating the growth of millions of cannabis plants just so he could go fight more wars. If only someone had told him to burn the flowers in a tent like the Scythians, maybe Anne Boleyn would have kept her head. Chill out, Henry. Have a hemp seed vapor bath, and let's talk about this divorce calmly. But, alas, history is full of missed opportunities. It wasn't just England. The whole age of exploration, Columbus, Magellan, all those guys getting lost and discovering places where people already lived, was powered by cannabis fiber. The Santa Maria? Rigged with hemp. The maps they drew? Often on hemp paper. The irony is that they were sailing to places like the Americas where tobacco and cocoa existed, creating this massive global exchange of vices. Getty Images. Explore. Speaking of the Americas, let's talk about when the plant actually crossed the Atlantic. It didn't just magically appear there. The Spanish brought it over. They introduced hemp to Chile in roughly 1545. Again, they wanted fiber for the Navy. But the plant, being a weed, escaped. It loved the climate. It started growing everywhere. And here is where things get a little murky and interesting. While the Europeans were obsessing over ropes, the African slaves who were brought to the Americas, specifically to Brazil in the Caribbean, carried with them the knowledge of the other uses of the plant. In Angola and other parts of West Africa, cannabis had been used recreationally and medicinally for a long time. When these populations were forced across the ocean, they brought that culture with them. So in Brazil, you started to see the Portuguese plantation owners getting confused. They'd see the enslaved people growing this rope plant in their small garden plots, but they weren't making ropes. They were smoking it in pipes or steeping it in water. They called it diamba or maconha. The Portuguese were generally suspicious of anything that brought the enslaved people joy or relief, so they naturally tried to ban it. In 1830, the City Council of Rio de Janeiro passed a law penalizing the smoking of cannabis. This is actually considered one of the very first anti-drug laws in the Americas, specifically targeting the psychoactive use. The penalty? A fine for the seller, and 3 days in jail for the user. Which, compared to the Egyptian emir pulling people's teeth out, was actually surprisingly lenient. But let's float back to Europe for a second, because while the Portuguese were banning it in Brazil, the French were about to have a very weird, very pretentious moment with hashish.
Hey guys, welcome back to the timeline. If you're just joining us, we're floating through the history of cannabis, and we just left the Middle East and the ancient world. Now I want you to picture Paris in the 1840s. It's rain-slicked cobblestones, gas lamps flickering, and a lot of men with very dramatic facial hair wearing velvet coats and looking miserable on purpose. This is the era of the Romantics. And if you know anything about Romantic poets, you know they love two things: complaining about their souls and taking substances that made their souls feel weird. Enter the Club des Hashishans, or the Club of the Hashish Eaters. This wasn't some back alley operation. This was an exclusive members-only group of the French literary elite. We're talking about guys like Victor Hugo, Alexandre Dumas, Charles Baudelaire, and Honoré de Balzac. Basically, the guys you were forced to read in AP English were all hanging out in a spooky old building called the Hôtel de Lausanne on the Ile Saint-Louis. The club was run by a doctor named Jacques-Joseph Moreau. Now, Dr. Moreau was a psychiatrist, or what they called an alienist back then, which is a way cooler name. He had traveled through the Middle East and seen how hashish was used. He had a theory that insanity was just a dream state that you couldn't wake up from. So, logically, he decided that if he wanted to cure insanity, he had to understand it. And the best way to understand it was to induce a temporary madness in himself and his writer buddies. You know, for science. They would meet at night. The hotel was dimly lit, full of tapestries and heavy curtains, very gothic, very extra. Dr. Moreau would serve them a substance called dawa-mesk. This wasn't a joint. They weren't passing around a pipe. Dawa-mesk was a greenish jam made of hashish, pistachio, sugar, orange juice, cinnamon, cloves, and cantharides, which is Spanish fly, a beetle extract, because why not make it weirder? They would eat a spoonful of this green sludge with their coffee and then just wait. We actually have detailed accounts of what happened because, again, these were writers. They couldn't do anything without writing a 10-page essay about it afterward. Théophile Gautier wrote that after eating the jam, he felt like he was dissolving. He said the eyelashes of the other guests turned into musical notes, and he could hear the color blue. He described himself as a sponge swelling with water. At one point, he looked at the doctor and saw his face turn into a spinning clock. It sounds terrifying, honestly, but for these guys, it was intellectual exploration. Alexandre Dumas, the guy who wrote The Three Musketeers, reportedly loved it. He was a big guy, full of life, and he apparently just laughed hysterically and ate all the snacks. Then there was Charles Baudelaire. Baudelaire is the quintessential emo poet. He's the guy who wrote The Flowers of Evil. He actually didn't like hashish that much. He tried it, but he was a control freak. He hated the feeling of losing his will. He later wrote a book called Artificial Paradises, where he basically said, yeah, it makes you feel like a god, but the next day you feel like a piece of soggy bread, and it destroys your motivation. He called it a weapon for suicide, which is very on brand for Baudelaire. He preferred wine and opium, which he felt were more dignified ways to ruin his life. Honoré de Balzac, another literary titan, tried it once. He claimed he heard celestial voices and then promptly decided never to do it again because he was convinced it would rob him of his willpower to write. And considering Balzac drank about 50 cups of coffee a day and wrote for 16 hours straight, his willpower was probably just a caffeine overdose in a human suit. The Club des Hashishans fizzled out eventually, but it introduced the idea of cannabis to the Western intellectual elite not as a medicine and not as a fiber, but as a way to unlock the mind. It was pretentious, sure, but it was also the first time in the West we see this counterculture vibe emerging around the plant. But let's leave the moody French poets in their velvet chairs and float across the English Channel to Victorian England. Things were very different here. While the French were eating green jam to see clock faces, the British were looking at this plant and thinking, how can we stick this in a medicine bottle?
The man responsible for this was William O'Shaughnessy. He was an Irish doctor working for the East India Company in Calcutta. In the 1830s, he noticed that the locals were using cannabis for all sorts of medical issues. Being a scientist, he decided to run some tests. He started with dogs, obviously. He gave a dog a massive dose, the dog fell asleep for a day, woke up, ate a huge meal, and was fine. So O'Shaughnessy moved on to humans. He treated patients with rheumatism, cholera, and tetanus. His reports are wild. He describes giving cannabis resin to patients who are having violent muscle spasms from tetanus, a horrific way to die, by the way, and the resin actually relaxed them enough to eat and sleep. He published his findings, and suddenly, cannabis was the new wonder drug in England. It was everywhere. You could walk into a Victorian pharmacy and buy cannabis tincture right off the shelf. It wasn't hidden. It sat right next to the aspirin and the laudanum. It was in corn removers. It was in cough syrup. It was in a product called chlorodyne, which was a mix of cannabis, morphine, and chloroform. People in the Victorian era were walking around absolutely medicated to the gills on a daily basis. It explains why they could stand wearing so many layers of wool in the summer. And this brings us to the most famous potential user of the era, Queen Victoria herself. Now, there is a persistent story that Queen Victoria was prescribed cannabis tincture by her private physician, Sir J. Russell Reynolds, to help with her menstrual cramps. Sir Russell Reynolds was a huge fan of the plant. He wrote in the medical journal The Lancet that cannabis was one of the most valuable medicines we possess. We don't have a diary entry from the Queen saying, "Dear Diary, took the drops today, feeling delightful, the corgis look hilarious." But it is highly probable she took it. The image is just fantastic. You have the Queen, the symbol of stiff, moralistic, repressive Victorian society, sitting in Buckingham Palace, wearing her black morning dress, sipping a cup of tea laced with a cannabis tincture, and just vibing. It puts a whole new spin on the phrase, "we are not amused." Maybe she wasn't unamused. Maybe she was just really focused on the pattern of the wallpaper. It wasn't just the Queen. It was totally normalized. There was no Reefer Madness panic yet. No one thought it made you a criminal. If you had a headache, you took it. If your baby was crying, hopefully you didn't give them the strong stuff. But let's be real, Victorian childcare was mostly just sedation. Let's float over the Atlantic now, to the United States in the late 19th century, the Gilded Age. America was busy building railroads, stealing land, and inventing capitalism. And just like in England, cannabis was on the pharmacy shelves. Squibb, Park Davis, Eli Lilly, all these big pharmaceutical companies that exist today, they were selling cannabis extracts. It was listed in the U.S. Pharmacopoeia, which is the official list of recognized medicines. But America also had its own version of the French hashish club moment. It came in the form of a young college kid named Fitzhugh Ludlow. In 1857, he published a book called The Hashish Eater. He was basically the first American drug memoirist. He was a student in Poughkeepsie, New York. He used to hang out at a local apothecary because he was a nerd and liked the smell of chemicals. One day, the pharmacist showed him a jar of tincture of hemp and said, "Hey, this stuff is weird. Be careful." Ludlow, being a college student, immediately took a massive dose. His book is hilarious because it's so over the top. He describes his hallucinations in the most flowery American prose. He talks about floating through the pyramids of Egypt, seeing vast architectural wonders, and feeling like he had lived for thousands of years in a single minute. He became a minor celebrity. He was the cool guy who knew about the exotic Eastern drug. It started a bit of a fad. For a brief window in the late 1800s, hashish candy was a thing. You could buy Gunjawala hashish candy in the mail. It was advertised as a most wonderful and harmless stimulant. People would eat it at parties. There's a legend, and historians fight about whether this is true, but I choose to believe it because it's funny, that at the 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia, which was a massive fair celebrating America's 100th birthday, there was a Turkish hashish pavilion. The story goes that genteel American ladies and gentlemen would go in, smoke a hookah, and then wander around looking at the steam engines and giant pumpkins on display. Whether there was a dedicated pavilion or just a Turkish exhibit that happened to have pipes, the vibe represents the era perfectly. It was exotic, it was foreign, but it wasn't dangerous yet. It was a novelty. So, when did it change? When did this medicine that Queen Victoria probably used and this candy that college kids ate become the devil's lettuce?
Well, as with most things in American history, the answer involves racism and a border. Let's drift into the early 20th century, roughly 1910. The Mexican Revolution is kicking off. It's messy, it's violent, and it causes a lot of people to flee Mexico and move north into Texas and the American Southwest. These immigrants brought with them their culture, and part of that culture was smoking marijuana. Note the word change. Before this, Americans called it cannabis or hashish. It sounded medical or exotic. But marijuana? That sounded foreign. It sounded Spanish. And in the 1910s America, nativism was on the rise. The white establishment in Texas didn't like these new immigrants. They looked for reasons to demonize them. They noticed that after a long day of hard labor in the fields, the workers would relax by smoking this plant. It was cheap, it grew wildly, and it took the edge off. Suddenly, the newspapers started running stories. But they weren't talking about the useful medicine from the pharmacy. They were talking about a killer weed used by Mexicans that gave them superhuman strength and made them violent. Which is ironic because anyone who has actually interacted with this plant knows that superhuman strength is usually not the side effect. It's usually superhuman ability to sit on a couch. But the narrative stuck. It was a tool of social control. If you could outlaw the habit of a specific group of people, you could police that group more easily. We also have to talk about Pancho Villa, the famous Mexican revolutionary general. His soldiers were known for smoking it, and this gave us one of the most famous songs in history, which you probably sang in elementary school without knowing what it meant. La cucaracha. You know the tune. La cucaracha, ya no puede caminar. Translate the lyrics. The cockroach can no longer walk because he lacks marijuana to smoke. Yeah, it's a song about a cockroach, which was a slang term for a soldier or a camp follower who is bummed out because he's out of weed. We teach this to kindergartners. Sing the drug-addicted bug song, kids. It's amazing how history hides in plain sight like that. By the 1920s, the vibe in America was shifting. Prohibition was in full swing. Alcohol was illegal. The moral crusaders were feeling very confident. They had banned the booze, and now they were looking around for the next thing to ban. And there was this marijuana floating up from the border and also, crucially, starting to appear in the jazz clubs of New Orleans. New Orleans is really the gateway for the recreational smoking culture in the U.S. The sailors brought it in from the Caribbean and South America. The black jazz musicians picked it up. They called it gleefa, muggles, reefer, or jazz cabbage. Why did jazz musicians like it? Well, Louis Armstrong, the absolute legend of jazz, was a lifelong user. He called it the gauge. He wrote in his biography that it made the music sound better. It slowed down time. If you're improvising a solo at a breakneck tempo, having the perception that time is slowing down is actually a huge advantage. It lets you fit more notes in, it lets you feel the rhythm deeper. So now you have a perfect storm for a moral panic. You have Mexican immigrants in the Southwest, and you have black jazz musicians in the cities, both using this substance. For the white conservative establishment of the 1920s and 30s, this was terrifying. It wasn't Queen Victoria's medicine anymore. It was the drug of the other. It was dangerous. It was subversive. It was making the kids listen to that wild jungle music called jazz. And stepping into this storm was a man named Harry Anslinger. If there is a villain in the story of weed, a mustache-twirling, over-the-top antagonist, it is Harry Anslinger. He was the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. But we're not going to get into the heavy legal stuff just yet. I want to linger on the vibe of the jazz age for a moment before the hammer comes down. Imagine a smoky club in Harlem or New Orleans in 1928. The air is thick, the music is loud, people are dancing the Charleston. It's the roaring 20s. Alcohol is illegal, so everyone is drinking questionable bathtub gin. But in the corner, there's a sweet, musky smell. It's the viper culture. Vipers was the slang for pot smokers because of the hissing sound you make when you take a quick drag on a joint. Sss. There were songs about it. If You're a Viper by Stuff Smith. The lyrics are literally, dreamed about a reefer, 5 feet long, mighty mez, but not too strong. You'll be high, but not for long, if you're a viper. It was cool.
It was underground. It was the hip thing to do. And unlike alcohol, which made people get into fistfights, the Vipers were known for being chill. They'd just sit there, nod their heads to the baseline, and eat an alarming amount of ribs. But the party couldn't last forever. The 1930s were coming, the Depression was coming, and Harry Anslinger was sharpening his pencil, getting ready to write some of the most ridiculous propaganda in human history. But before we get to the Reefer Madness era and the flying saucers of the 1940s, let's just take a second to appreciate this weird little window of time. A time when you could buy hashish candy in the mail, Queen Victoria was medicating her cramps, and Louis Armstrong was inventing modern music while floating on a cloud of gauge. It was a brief moment of equilibrium before the hammer smashed it all to pieces.
Hey guys, welcome back. We're deep in the weeds now. Pun intended, I guess, though I promise no loud punchlines. We just left the jazz age, where everyone was having a relatively chill time being vipers and listening to Louis Armstrong. But as we drift into the 1930s, the vibe changes completely. The room gets colder, the lights get harsher. A man in a suit walks in, and he looks like he really hates fun. Enter Harry Anslinger. If you were casting a movie about a grumpy bureaucrat who wants to ruin everyone's weekend, you would cast Harry Anslinger. He had a square jaw, receding hairline, and the general demeanor of a bulldog that's been denied a treat. He was the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Now, here's the funny thing about Harry. Initially, he didn't care about cannabis. He famously called it a nuisance, but not a threat. He was a prohibition agent. His job was chasing rum runners and smashing whiskey barrels. But then in 1933, prohibition ended. Alcohol was legal again. Suddenly, Harry and his entire department were looking at a massive budget cut. They needed a new dragon to slay. They needed a new public enemy number one to keep the funding flowing. So, Harry pivoted. He looked at that nuisance weed and decided to give it a makeover. He stopped calling it cannabis, which sounded too scientific, and exclusively used the word marijuana. He wanted to play up the foreign angle. He wanted to associate it with the Mexican immigrants and the dangerous jazz musicians we talked about earlier. He started compiling what became known as the Gore Files. This was basically a scrapbook of the worst crimes he could find in the police blotters. If someone committed a murder with an axe, Harry would check if they had ever smoked a joint. If they had, boom, it was a marijuana murder. It didn't matter if the guy was also clinically insane or drinking turpentine. The weed was the culprit. He went to Congress and told stories that were just wild. He claimed that a monster like Frankenstein met a marijuana addict, the monster would drop dead of fright. He told a story about a colored man in Florida who looked at a white woman twice and then killed her family, solely because of the drug. It was fear-mongering 101, mixed with a very heavy dose of 1930s racism. He claimed it caused temporary insanity. He said it made pacifists into killers. And this brings us to the crown jewel of anti-cannabis propaganda, the 1936 film Reefer Madness. If you have never seen Reefer Madness, you should watch it when you have insomnia. It is spectacularly bad. It was originally titled Tell Your Children, and it was funded by a church group before being bought by an exploitation film producer. The plot is hilarious by modern standards. It starts with a very serious scroll of text warning the audience about a new and deadly scourge. Then we meet some clean-cut high school kids. They play tennis. They do their homework. They are the epitome of wholesome. Then they get invited to an apartment by some shady characters to try reefer. The reaction these actors have to the smoke is Oscar-worthy for all the wrong reasons. They take one puff and instantly turn into maniacs. They laugh uncontrollably at nothing. One guy demands that a girl play the piano faster. Faster, he yells. She plays faster. The music gets frantic.
It's implied that the weed is making her play the piano so aggressively that she's losing her mind. Then, inevitably, things go wrong. There's a hallucination, a fight breaks out, a gun goes off, someone dies, a kid jumps out a window. It's a slippery slope fallacy turned into a feature-length film. One joint, and suddenly you are an accomplice to murder and jumping out of a building. The film ends with a stern man pointing at the camera and yelling, "The next tragedy may be that of your daughters or yours." People in the 30s were terrified. They didn't have the internet to fact-check this stuff. They just saw a movie where a nice boy turned into a piano-playing psychopath, and they thought, well, we better ban that. And that's exactly what happened. In 1937, Congress passed the Marijuana Tax Act. This was a sneaky piece of legislation. It didn't technically make cannabis illegal, because the federal government didn't really have the constitutional power to just ban a substance outright at that time. Instead, they used a tax loophole. The law said that if you wanted to deal in cannabis, you had to buy a tax stamp.
Here's the catch. To get the stamp, you had to bring the cannabis you had to the office to declare it. But possessing the cannabis without the stamp was illegal. So if you showed up to buy the stamp, you were arresting yourself. It was a classic catch-22. The funniest part of the hearings for this bill involved the American Medical Association, the AMA. The AMA sent a guy named Dr. William Woodward to testify. Now remember, doctors had been prescribing cannabis for decades. It was in the pharmacopoeia. Dr. Woodward stood up and basically said, "Hey, we didn't realize this bill was about cannabis because you guys kept calling it marijuana in Spanish. We use cannabis as a medicine. Please don't ban our medicine." Congress and Anslinger basically told him to sit down and be quiet. They passed the bill, and just like that, the useful medicine of Queen Victoria and the sacred plant of the Scythians effectively vanished from legal society in America. But then, plot twist, World War II happened. 4 years after banning the plant and telling everyone it would make them murder their families with an axe, the US government suddenly realized, oh no, we need rope. Japan had seized the Philippines, which was the main source of hemp fiber for the US Navy. The US tried to import jute from India, but German U-boats were sinking the ships. The supply chain was broken. The Navy needed rope for rigging. The Army needed webbing for parachutes. They needed shoelaces. They needed thread. So the USDA, the same government that just demonized the plant, released a film called Hemp for Victory. You can't make this up. It's a cheerful, patriotic, instructional film. It shows farmers how to plow their fields and plant hemp seeds. It talks about the glory of the American harvest. It doesn't mention Reefer Madness. It doesn't mention the killer weed. It just says, hey farmers, grow this for the war effort. Farmers who grew it were draft exempt in some cases. 4-H clubs, groups of children were encouraged to grow hemp. They grew thousands of acres of it across the Midwest. This is why even today in states like Nebraska and Kansas, you can find ditchweed growing wild by the side of the road. It's the feral grandchildren of the Hemp for Victory crops. Of course, the moment the war ended, the government went right back to banning it. Thanks for the ropes, guys. Now burn the fields and never speak of this again. It's a level of gaslighting that is honestly impressive. Let's fast forward a bit now. We're drifting out of the 40s and into the 50s. The post-war era, suburbs, white picket fences, conformity. But in the shadows of the cities, something was brewing. The Beat Generation. These were the writers who rejected the American dream. Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, William S. Burroughs. They hung out in coffee shops in New York and San Francisco, wore black turtlenecks, played bongos, and wrote poetry that didn't rhyme. And of course, they smoked tea. For the Beats, marijuana wasn't a party drug like it was for the jazz crowd, and it wasn't a madness drug like Anslinger said. It was an intellectual tool. It was about expanding consciousness. Allen Ginsberg famously led a march where he advocated for the legalization of pot way back in the 50s. He called it a benevolent herb. This set the stage for the big explosion, the 1960s. If the 1920s was the reefer era, the 1960s was the pot era. The baby boomers were going to college. They were looking at their parents' world, the world of gray suits, martinis, and nuclear bomb drills, and they said, no thanks. Cannabis became the symbol of the counterculture. It was the peace pipe. It was shared in circles. It wasn't just about getting high, it was a political statement. If the government said this is bad, and the government was also doing Vietnam, then maybe this was actually good. The cultural shift was massive. You had Bob Dylan introducing the Beatles to weed in a hotel room in New York in 1964. Legend has it that the Beatles were drinking scotch and coke, and Dylan was like, "You guys ever try this?" Ringo Starr apparently smoked the whole joint himself because he didn't know the etiquette of puff, puff, pass. He spent the rest of the night giggling. After that night, the Beatles' music changed. They went from "I Want to Hold Your Hand" to "Rubber Soul" and "Revolver." The lyrics got weirder, the sounds got deeper. You can practically hear the influence of the plant in the bass lines. But as the clouds of smoke grew thicker over college campuses and rock festivals like Woodstock, the government panicked again. Enter Richard Nixon. Nixon is like the spiritual successor to Harry Anslinger, but with more paranoia and a tape recorder. Nixon hated the anti-war movement, and he hated the counterculture. He saw drugs as the fuel for both. In 1971, he declared the war on drugs. He called drug abuse public enemy number one. But here is the most government thing that happened in the 70s. Nixon appointed a commission to study marijuana, hoping they would come back with a report saying it was pure evil. It was called the Schaefer Commission. The commission did a really thorough job. They studied the science, the sociology, the history, and in 1972, they handed their report to Nixon. The report basically said, actually, Mr. President, marijuana isn't that big of a deal. It doesn't cause violence. It's not physically addictive like heroin. We recommend decriminalizing it for personal use. Nixon was, not pleased. There are actual tapes of him ranting about the commission. He famously threw the report in the trash, metaphorically, and maybe literally. He ignored the science entirely and doubled down on enforcement. He placed marijuana in Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act, right next to heroin. Schedule 1 means high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use. Remember Queen Victoria's cramp medicine? Remember the Hemp for Victory parachutes? Remember the thousands of years of medical texts? Yeah, the US government decided in 1970 that none of that existed. No accepted medical use. This classification is what created the weird legal limbo we lived in for the next 50 years. It created the DEA, it filled the prisons, it turned a plant that grew in ditches in Nebraska into a contraband commodity worth billions of dollars. But let's step back from the heavy politics for a second and look at the culture of the 70s. Because while Nixon was fuming in the Oval Office, the culture was getting hazy. We're talking about Cheech and Chong. In 1978, the movie Up in Smoke came out. This was the anti-Reefer Madness. In Reefer Madness, weed made you a killer. In Up in Smoke, weed made you an idiot, but a lovable, harmless idiot. It was a comedy. It normalized the stoner archetype, the guy who's forgetful, hungry, and generally confused, but having a great time. This archetype became a staple of American media. You see it everywhere. Shaggy from Scooby-Doo. I mean, come on. He's always hungry, he's paranoid, he talks to a dog. We all knew what Shaggy was doing in the back of the Mystery Machine. The 80s tried to push back again. We got Nancy Reagan and Just Say No. We got the DARE program, where police officers would go into elementary schools and tell kids that if they smoked weed, they would never get a job and their teeth would fall out. I remember DARE. I remember sitting in a gymnasium listening to a cop explain that drug dealers would try to give us free drugs in the form of temporary tattoos. I spent the next 10 years disappointingly waiting for someone to offer me a free drug tattoo. It never happened. It turns out drug dealers are actually capitalists, and they don't give away inventory for free. But despite the Just Say No campaign, the momentum was shifting. The medical argument, the one Dr. Woodward tried to make in 1937, was coming back. In the late 80s and early 90s, the AIDS crisis hit San Francisco hard. It was a tragedy. But amidst the horror, activists like Dennis Perone noticed something. Cannabis helped the patients. It helped with the wasting syndrome. It gave them an appetite. It eased the pain. These activists opened cannabis buyers clubs. They were illegal, strictly speaking, but the local police often looked the other way because it was clearly an act of compassion. This grassroots movement in the Castro district of San Francisco is really the birthplace of the modern legalization movement. It wasn't about getting high anymore. It was about dignity and medicine again. It was the ghost of Emperor Shennong returning to say, "I told you so." And that leads us to 1996. California passed Proposition 215, becoming the first state to legalize medical marijuana. It was a crack in the dam. It's been a slow, strange drip since then. We went from Reefer Madness to medical cards to dispensaries that look like Apple stores. It is truly bizarre to think about the journey we've just floated through. We started with Scythians howling in a tent. We watched Chinese monks try to become immortal. We saw Queen Victoria chilling in a palace. We saw French poets eating green jam. We saw a jazz musician invent cool. We saw a bureaucrat invent a monster. We saw a president ignore a report. And now you can walk into a store in many parts of the world, show your ID, and buy a gummy that is scientifically engineered to make you feel exactly the right amount of sleepy. But we aren't quite done yet. Because while humans were busy fighting over the laws, the plant itself was changing. The weed that the Scythians smoked, the weed that Woodstock hippies smoked, it was basically oregano compared to what exists today. We need to talk about the botany of the modern era. We need to talk about the underground growers who spent decades in basements breeding this plant into a super potent biological powerhouse. We need to talk about skunk.
Hey guys, welcome back to the timeline. We floated through ancient tents, Victorian pharmacies, and the jazz clubs of New Orleans. We watched Harry Anslinger lose his mind over a plant, and we saw the counterculture embrace it. But now, we need to shift gears. We need to get a little bit scientific. Well, bro-scientific. If you traveled back in time to Woodstock in 1969, and you took a puff of the joint being passed around by a guy in a tie-dye shirt named Moonbeam, you would probably be disappointed. By modern standards, the weed of the 1960s and 70s was distinctively weak. We're talking maybe 3% or 4% THC. It was mostly leaves, stems, and seeds. It was what we would today call dirt weed or swag. It was imported by the ton from Mexico or Colombia, compressed into bricks that looked like slightly greener cow manure, and it gave you a mild headache along with your giggle fit. So how did we get from that to the nuclear-grade, laser-focused, one hit and you're contemplating the geometry of the universe stuff that exists today? The answer lies in a combination of global travel, biological hacking, and the unintended consequences of the war on drugs. Let's float back to the early 1970s. This was the era of the hippie trail. Young Westerners, bored with suburbia, would pack a backpack and travel overland from Europe to India and Nepal. They weren't just looking for enlightenment. They were looking for the good stuff. While passing through Afghanistan and the Hindu Kush mountain range, they discovered something. The local cannabis plants there didn't look like the tall, spindly sativa plants from Mexico or Thailand. They were short, they were fat, they had broad leaves, and they were incredibly resinous. They had evolved in a harsh, cold mountain climate, so they were tough, and they finished flowering quickly before the snow fell. These were the cannabis indica plants. The travelers, being enterprising stoners, didn't just smoke it. They collected the seeds. They put them in their socks, their camera bags, and hollowed out books, and they brought them back to California and the Netherlands. This was the moment everything changed. It was the genetic mixer. Before this, you mostly had sativas, tall plants that took forever to grow and got you high in a cerebral, energetic way.
Now you had indicas, short plants that grew fast and got you stoned in a heavy, body-numbing way. In the hills of Northern California, specifically the Emerald Triangle, Humboldt, Mendocino, Trinity counties, the growers started breeding these two types together. It was agricultural alchemy. They wanted the high of the sativa, but the fast growth and density of the indica. This birthed the first modern hybrids, and the most famous of these, the Adam and Eve of modern weed, was skunk number 1. The story goes that a group of growers known as the Sacred Seeds Collective, led by a guy known as Sam the Skunk Man, David Watson, developed this strain. It was stable, it grew consistently, it had a high yield, and it smelled like a roadkill skunk, but in a good way, if you're into that. Skunk number 1 became the backbone of almost every strain that followed. If you've ever smoked weed that smelled pungent and made you hungry, you likely have Sam the Skunk Man to thank. But genetics was only half the battle. The other half was technique. And the biggest breakthrough in technique was realizing that the male plants are useless freeloaders. See, cannabis is dioecious. It has male and female plants. In nature, the wind blows pollen from the male to the female makes seeds, and the cycle continues. But for a smoker, seeds are bad. They explode when you burn them, which is a mood killer, and they take energy away from the plant. Growers realized that if you killed all the men, sorry guys, the female plants would go into a state of reproductive desperation. They would pour all their energy into producing sticky, resinous flowers in a futile attempt to catch pollen that would never come. It's basically sexual frustration turned into potency. This method was called sin semilla, which is just Spanish for without seed. Suddenly, the weed wasn't 4% THC anymore. It was creeping up to 10%, 12%. It was becoming a premium product.
But just as the quality was going up, the risk was going up too. In the late 70s and 80s, the US government started spraying Mexican fields with paraquat, a toxic herbicide. This terrified American smokers. They didn't want to smoke poison. So demand for domestic, US-grown weed skyrocketed. Then the Reagan administration ramped up the pressure. They started using helicopters with heat-seeking cameras to find illegal fields in California. They launched Operation Camp, Campaign Against Marijuana Planting. This forced the growers to adapt. If they couldn't grow outside because of the helicopters, they would grow inside. Welcome to the era of the closet grower. This is where the history of weed merges with the history of technology. To grow inside, you needed light. You couldn't just use a desk lamp. You needed the power of the sun in a basement. Growers started borrowing technology from commercial agriculture and, weirdly enough, NASA. They used high-pressure sodium and metal halide lights. These were the orange street lights you see on highways. Growers would wire these massive, hot, buzzing lights into their attics and basements. They also adopted hydroponics. Hydro became a buzzword in the 90s. It sounds futuristic, but it just means growing plants in water and nutrients instead of soil. It's cleaner, faster, and allows for total control. This shifted the culture of growing from farmers in overalls to nerds in lab coats. Underground growers became amateur botanists and electricians. They had to figure out ventilation to hide the smell. They had to figure out cooling because the lights were so hot. They had to figure out how to bypass the electric meter so the utility company didn't wonder why a 2-bedroom house was using enough electricity to power a stadium. It was a cat and mouse game. The DEA would look for heat signatures on roofs from the grow lights, so growers started insulating their attics. The DEA would look for high power bills, so growers bought diesel generators. And amidst all this pressure, the genetics had to flee. In the mid-80s, facing intense raids, Sam the Skunk Man and other top breeders packed their bags and their seeds and flew to the one place in the world that would have them, Amsterdam.
The Netherlands had adopted a policy of tolerance. They didn't fully legalize it, but they decided to stop arresting people for small amounts. Coffee shops opened up where you could buy hash and weed over the counter. When the American genetics, skunk, haze, and northern lights arrived in Amsterdam, it was like the Renaissance. The Dutch growers took these seeds and professionalized the industry. They created the first seed banks. Companies like Sensi Seeds and Greenhouse Seeds started selling seeds by mail order. They created the High Times Cannabis Cup, a yearly competition to see who grew the best bud. It was the Olympics of weed. Judges would wander around Amsterdam sampling 30 different types of super strong cannabis and then try to fill out a scorecard without falling asleep or eating the scorecard. This is where the branding of weed started. Before this, you just had pot. Maybe Acapulco Gold if you were fancy. Now you had names that sounded like heavy metal bands or dessert items. White Widow, Super Silver Haze, AK-47, Bubblegum, Blueberry. The names are a whole history in themselves. AK-47 was named because it was a one-hit wonder. It hit you hard. Trainwreck was named because, well, you get the idea. And then you have the weird ones like cat piss. I promise you, that is a real strain. It is prized for its ammonia-like smell. Why humans want to smell something that smells like a litter box is a psychological mystery we don't have time to unpack tonight. Let's drift back to the US in the 90s and 2000s. While Amsterdam was the capital of cannabis culture, American pop culture was doing its own thing. Hip-hop embraced the plant even more than jazz had. Dr. Dre's The Chronic came out in 1992. Chronic was slang for high-quality hydroponic weed. The artwork literally featured a marijuana leaf. It wasn't subtle. Snoop Dogg became the global ambassador for the plant. If Queen Victoria was the secret patron saint of the 19th century, Snoop was the very loud, very visible patron saint of the turn of the millennium. And then the internet happened. For a long time, growing knowledge was secret. You had to know a guy who knew a guy, or maybe you found a dusty copy of the Anarchist Cookbook or a specialized grow Bible. But with the internet, forums appeared. Overgrow.com. Growers started sharing photos. They swapped tips. They troubleshooted each other's nutrient deficiencies. Hey, my leaves are turning yellow. What gives? This open-source sharing of information accelerated the quality even more. A kid in a basement in Ohio could learn the exact techniques used by a master grower in Vancouver. The collective intelligence of the underground combined to create plants that were frankly terrifyingly strong. We went from 12% THC in the 90s to 20, 25, even 30% in the 2010s. And this brings us to the modern era of legalization. When Colorado and Washington voted to legalize recreational use in 2012, the floodgates opened. But what's fascinating is how the industry corporatized so quickly. We went from sketchy guy in a parking lot handing you a sandwich bag to Apple Store aesthetic with iPads and bud tenders. The term bud tender is hilarious to me. It implies a level of sommelier-like expertise. Oh yes, this strain has notes of diesel and lemon. It pairs well with watching cartoons and forgetting where you put your keys.
But the biggest shift in the modern era isn't just smoking the flower. It's the concentrates. Dabs, wax, oil, vape pens. Science didn't stop at making the plant stronger. They figured out how to extract the essential oils completely. We are now seeing products that are 90% THC. This is light years away from the Scythian tent. If a Scythian warrior took a hit from a modern dab rig, he would probably assume he had died and gone to the spirit world instantly. He wouldn't howl with pleasure. He would just lay down and stare at the sky for 6 hours. There's a bit of irony in the modern legal market. We have more variety than ever, but we also have less mystery. It's a commodity now. It's tracked from seed to sale with barcodes. It's tested for mold and pesticides. It's taxed heavily. It's safe, sure, but it's also bureaucratic. In a way, the legalization movement killed the stoner culture. The subversive thrill is gone. You aren't a rebel anymore. You're just a consumer standing in line to pay sales tax on a botanical product. But let's not get too cynical. The fact that we are here at all is kind of a miracle. Think about the journey we've just taken. We started with a weed growing on the steppes of Central Asia, used for rope and funeral parties. It traveled down the Silk Road to China, where emperors looked at it through transparent stomachs. It went to India, where Shiva snacked on it and sadhus drank it in milk. It spread to the Middle East, where Sufis used it to find God, and emirs tried to pull people's teeth out to stop it. It sailed across the ocean on ships rigged with its own fibers. It landed in the Americas, where it was smoked by revolutionaries and jazz musicians. It was demonized by a bureaucrat who needed a budget increase. It was banned, burned, and sprayed with poison. And yet, it survived. It hid in basements. It hid in attics. It flew on airplanes to Amsterdam. It was bred by nerds and protected by patients. It is the ultimate survivor. It's a plant that convinced humanity to carry it around the world, risk prison time to protect it, and build entire indoor ecosystems just to keep it alive. In evolutionary terms, cannabis has completely won the game. It has domesticated us. We work for it. We build it houses. We feed it perfectly balanced nutrients. And in exchange, it gives us a few hours of feeling like everything is going to be okay. So, the next time you see a dispensary, or smell that familiar skunky scent wafting from a passing car, or just see a hemp t-shirt, remember the history. Remember the Scythian tent. Remember Queen Victoria's tincture. Remember the jazz clubs. Remember the basement scientists. It's been a long, strange trip for this little green plant, and honestly, it seems like it's just getting started. Now, usually I would say stay awake, but considering the topic and the vibe, I think it's appropriate to say the opposite. Let the timeline fade out, let the smoke clear. This concludes our deep dive into the history of the world's most controversial weed. If you're still awake, you can click on another video to drift somewhere else. If not, sweet dreams.